to create something that will.
All right, man, that was some technical difficulties. Hello, everyone. Those of you listening at home via podcast, hello. It took me a little while for the live stream to get up and going, but I got it figured out, I think. I better check it just in case. So I had to go to the backup YouTube server for some reason. I'm not quite sure why I had to do that, but yeah, here I am, hopefully. So hope all you doing well. Today is September 11th, 2019. Happy birthday, Mom. And today's topic is one of my favorites, actually, to talk about, which is free energy and Overunity, perpetual motion. And looks like we're working. So sorry for the delay. I saw some people were waiting and then they disappeared because it took me 25 minutes to get this going. A little over 25 minutes. So, but here I am. So let's start into it. So from the time, well, I don't know. I actually don't know when it started. I was supposed to have a guest on today, but it fell through. No worries. That's the way it goes. So it's going to be me talking to you guys and talking about some stuff I'm deeply passionate about, I should say. But starting probably from, well, at least from Da Vinci's time, and probably before that, there was this idea of Overunity or perpetual motion. If you don't know what that is, I'll explain it. So essentially, perpetual motion is a machine, some type of device that will run forever. Overunity is basically the same principle. It's when the coefficient of power is greater than 1, which means that the machine feeds itself with energy that outweighs its amount of force it puts out, or outweighs the amount of energy that you put into the system, I guess. So it's more energy out than in. And there's some deep philosophical beliefs on this, but for the most part, I mean, free energy and free energy devices are something that are taboo and very on the fringe. And I completely understand why, because of the laws of thermodynamics in place. And essentially, the laws of thermodynamics, the first and second law, the first law states that energy can neither be created nor destroyed, which both upholds the idea of free energy and also kind of destroys the idea of free energy simultaneously, which makes it a very philosophical topic. And then the second law of thermodynamics states that, the dependent, like the energy you put into a system slowly gets more complex. And so basically, like if you, in terms of hot and cold, if you put heat into a cold system, that heat will be dissipated and, basically goes into chaos of unknowing. Like you don't know, like the heat's just going into a greater system. Because one thing that's not really stated in the laws of thermodynamics, I feel enough, is that systems are always getting more complex, and systems are, they are very there's no just two systems. There's no closed loop, and I think that's kind of a big misnomer of a lot of law of thermodynamic discussion. And what a lot of people say, is that, things are getting more chaotic, or, looking at things as just one system to another, rather than looking at things from like multiple systems. And by systems, I mean the ability to store energy, like capacity of a system and how energetic that system is. So let's get right into some of the first free energy. And one of the first ever that I know of, that I can think of, is what's called the Perpetual Wheel, or Da Vinci's wheel. And essentially it's a wheel that is, let's see if I can spell Da Vinci. It's a wheel that is like overbalanced. So on one side it has, like on spokes, the spokes will push like a weight. So it's an overbalanced wheel. And for those who are viewing the live stream, I have examples here. But essentially it looks like a wheel, and then there's usually some type of rollers that slide forward or hammers that fall forward. And the idea of it is that it's always chasing after itself. The beauty of it, though, is that it doesn't work. And I say the beauty of that for a very good reason, because if it did work, people would be able to drop a pebble in an ocean, and that pebble would affect the entire ocean and just keep going and going and going. And so it's kind of along the lines of the principles of what's called the inverse square law, but just a better analogy of it is that over distance and time, energy decreases, at a certain rate, like it's half. I'll go into the exact explanation of it. And so the inverse square law is the intensity at surface of sphere is the surface is over 4 pi to the radius squared, and that's what your intensity becomes. It slowly is, it's kind of like cell division. If you think about it, it's really interesting because when a cell divides, you have one cell that splits into two, but then inside of the cell there's a what's called a stem, or not stem, what is it called? A rod. It basically splits in half every cell division, and this is basically what it makes us get older. What's interesting is, like in sharks, it doesn't split in half. Instead, it splits in like a quarter, or less than that even, and it makes sharks live for a lot longer periods of time. And there's other animals that represent that. But essentially, in physics, the inverse square law pretty much applies to many forms of energy. And so that's kind of the foundation of the free energy and why it can't work. And so I'm going to play both sides here. I'm not going to be biased, although I'm going to go into some free energy devices that many people talk about, that are, some of them may have some credence, but for the most part they're complete bullshit, to be honest. But and they're bullshit because they've been time tested and tried over and over. One example is the Da Vinci wheel, and there's some modifications to the Da Vinci wheel. There's later a Middle Eastern man who preceded Newton's calculus equations, actually came up with a lot of what Newton later came up with in calculus. He's a Middle Eastern man who had his own version of this wheel that he used mercury in. The idea of mercury is that it was, it's much heavier than water, and that it doesn't have, but it still is liquid, and it can flow easily without having any extra moving parts. And there's some other ideas behind that. So whether you're a believer or not, this is going to be pretty fun to go over. And if you guys have any questions, let me know in the comments. Let me know in the chat. And for those listening at home, you can always send me a message if you have any questions on any of this stuff. So we start with the Da Vinci wheel. Let's dive into some of the most controversial topics. So one of the most controversial, I would have to say, actually one of the most publicized, I'd have to say, and pretty controversial, is something called the Bedini motor. And let me give you a little backstory into why I got into the whole free energy stuff and the ideas of this. So there's this game that some of you may have heard of, or may not have heard of. It's called Minecraft. And when it first came out, I started playing that and was modding it. And with modding developers, a modification is just adding more code to the game to make it more complex and do some cool stuff with it. But in one of those modifications was something called industrial craft. And then there was other like mods that attached onto it that allowed you to basically create circuitry and stuff like that. And so I was playing this game and with some buddies, and one friend in particular was like, "Hey, you could do all this in real life." And that's not only simultaneously like ruined video games for me for the most part, but it also got me really interested in engineering. And I've always been interested in science and especially theoretical science and physics and stuff like that. But this kind of was a game changer. Like it kind of, it changed my whole paradigm on how to view things, and how instead of playing this game, I could perhaps go out and make these things in real life, because I made like solar panels, completely autonomous systems, automated systems, I should say, that would allocate resources and all that kind of stuff. So I started exploring things I could do in real life, and one of my biggest things I had the question of is, well, could you make something that's extremely efficient, right? Or if it's really efficient, and classic engineering questions, or if it's extremely efficient, can you make something that's that basically could run forever, right? And power things, or be an incredible way to power devices or whatever it might be, make life easier for humans. Like that's always I always want to give whatever I can to people, and so that there couldn't be any nobler cause in creating something like that. And so as I went down that rabbit hole, and let me tell you, it is a deep rabbit hole. I mean, you'll go into ancient Egypt and the Baghdad battery and aliens, and it just goes all over the place as far as this type of technology goes. And it's the government has secret technology, yada yada yada. It's pretty intense, and it's also extremely difficult to navigate between what's true and what's false, and do your fact checking. It can be really challenging sometimes, to the point to where you just have to test it yourself. And in one of those particular cases is this thing called the Bedini motor. It was it was created or recreated perhaps by a man named Bedini. Let's see, what was his first name? His first name escapes me right now. But him, and there's another motor that's kind of similar. Actually, they're a little bit different. One's switching with a transistor, and one switches with actual mechanical switching. But it's Joseph Newman. These two were kind of like the motor generator dudes, and there's quite a few others, to be honest. But these are probably the two biggest players. And the Bedini motor really fascinated me in that it's a transistor motor, and it's been around for since the 50s or 60s. But the particular way that this one was done is that what Bedini said was that you would get more energy out than you put in, defying the laws of physics. And it was of course through the Zeropoint Energy. And I guess I should probably preface this, because most of this technology is related to Zeropoint Energy. And what Zeropoint Energy is that in the universe there is an incredibly dense amount of energy in what's called the vacuum. It's vacuum fluctuations, or they're like virtual particles, dark matter. All these things relate to what's the Zeropoint Energy, or the Bose-Einstein condensate is what Einstein labeled it as, or helped to label it as. And there's lots of different terms used and thrown around, but essentially it's pulling energy from the quantum level into the macro level, so from very small to very large. What's interesting that I think a lot of people don't notice is the electron itself is already in the quantum level, and manipulating the electrons is what we're already kind of stirring up the energy from the vacuum realm, I guess, the 0 point, which is, if somebody who is really into electrical engineering, electrodynamics, already kind of understands those principles. Like a magnet goes by a coil set, and that coil, this is pretty much how all energy is made, as far as electromechanical energy, is that a magnet passes over a coil and excites the coil through a quantum exchange of electrons, and moving and undulating and bringing things out of balance, basically, from using kinetic force and putting it into electrical force, or kinetic energy into electrical energy. And then you're able to use that. That's what generators do. And a motor works in the opposite manner. So saying that, the Bedini motor is basically like a bifilar style motor. And we'll go some of these images. And the unfortunate part is a lot of this is just for profitability. And you can see some of these examples of this motor. There's many different examples and many different ways to use it, but it was basically for exciting and charging batteries, and the batteries that are dead or dying, you are able to do like a trickle charge, high voltage pulses that excite the battery to make it come back to life. Now that part of it, as testing it myself, is somewhat true. However, I don't think that it extends the battery of the life. It just knocks off the sulfuric, or the, let's see, I don't think it's lead sulfate, but the sulfate that builds up on the lead plates inside of the galvanic cell or inside the battery. It kind of knocks that off by throwing some back EMF or some back electromagnetic force, some back current in the batteries, like are a little bit more high voltage. So in that sense, it does do that, but you can do that with just a standard transistor. You don't necessarily need a motor for that. But the motor aspect of it incorporates like a flywheel principle. So you're basically taking electromagnetic energy, putting it into a flywheel, spinning the flywheel, and you're charging one battery by using the power of the flywheel and keeping another battery maintained. Now the issue with this, through countless testing that I've done, because I've done it like over 2 years of playing around with just the Bedini motor itself, is that it doesn't work. I mean, for the simple fact of the chemistry of the batteries, like it may look like it's working at face value, but then after you get the information over a certain amount of time, you start to realize like, wait a minute, yeah, the batteries just go right back to where they were. You know, the batteries are still at their. Both batteries are lower than they were before. One battery, it's basically like a balancer. You're basically taking energy from one battery to another battery, but losing power in making something move like a flywheel. And to top it off, the purpose of a motor is to do work, and there's very little work you can actually do with the Bedini motor. It doesn't have that much torque, and it can spin a fan, but it's like, it's just as powerful as was an electrostatic motor, just as powerful. So that's the Bedini motor. The Joseph Newman motor is a little bit different. A motor generator, I should say. These are motor generators. It's a little different, but the concept's basically the same. You're moving a large flywheel. The difference with the Newman motors is using high voltage pulses to spin a large mass. And the concept, I think, really behind it is to use a crap ton of copper, or it doesn't matter if it's copper or aluminum, a crap ton of conductive coiling, and it's to bring in zero-point energy from that amount of mass. That's the idea behind it. However, from my experiments, again, it doesn't really work. Like, the COP is never 1, let alone exceeding 1. So you never get your energy that you put in back out of it, or even, and yeah, so it's really not the most efficient. However, I also like to say for both of these, as far as just straight up mechanical movement, they are relatively efficient, averaging like with the Bedini. I haven't got a accurate measurement on the Newman motor, but on the Bedini motor, the COP, it ranges from like 30 to 50%, depending on how well you dial it in, which is pretty good considering a lot of motors. But it's about as good as a 3-phase DC motor with a pulse frequency modulator, some type of controller, a pulsed controller. So it's really, the efficiency is not all there. It's not super impressive compared to its claims of being over unity. So that being said, the motor generator we can kind of do away with. Let's take a dive into. Okay, so there's one more. It's called the DePalma. It would be a homopolar motor the way it's designed. So it's DePalma homopolar motor. Bruce DePalma, the N machine, that's what it's called. So the principle behind the N machine, again, it's based off of zero-point energy. The difference with this one is it's driven by DC, and it it has a homopolar design, which I don't know if you know what a homopolar motor is. It's essentially an induction motor where you put a DC current on a conductive plate that's in between a magnetic field, so a north and a south. It spins. Like it's a classic experiment from the time of Michael Faraday, and incredibly interesting, and really got people's minds going about the original electricians. Which the story goes that the name electricians actually came from magicians, right? And a lot of the experimenters and people who were really getting into electrical engineering were doing demonstrations to get people to understand and get people curious and interested in it. And I don't remember what they called it at that time, but they had to come up with a name. And so one of the buzz names, it probably came from a newspaper or something, was the electrician. Just like the magician, it's the electrician. So it's kind of a backstory on that. It's pretty interesting stuff. But nonetheless, from all of my research and everything, there hasn't been too much evidence that this produces unity or over unity. And one of the main reasons is that it loses a lot if you've ever messed with induction motors, and especially the homopolar motor, it loses a lot of efficiency through heat. Now, in this homopolar, I have a page pulled up for DePalma.com, which is the guy, the man, the myth, the legend. DePalma's belief is the configuration would produce efficiencies greater than 100%, which would mean produce more energy output than energy required to rotate the device. Clearly at odds with established physical laws, his work has been ignored by the traditional scientific community. Now, this is one of those ones where I don't have, I'm not going to say it works or it doesn't work, but usually the simplest explanations are what the facts are. So I would, if I had to put money on it, I'd say that it does not produce 100% or more, simply because a motor is designed, unless you're measuring the actual work that's put in the output. I do know that the DePalma, or I should say the homopolar motors and induction motors can have quite a significant amount of torque, and they're driven off of amps more than they are off of voltage, which is something to consider. So it's kind of the flip side of the last two motor generators I talked about. But nonetheless, they are still speculative at best. So there's a documentary you can watch on YouTube, and a lot of these inventors feel like they're being silenced. They're put to, they're put on the shelf because the establishment doesn't want to get away from oil and things of that nature, which is it is a valid argument if you think about corporations, corporate entities, and actually goes really at the heart of free energy in general, which is something that I'll talk about later in this podcast. But for this upfront part, we're just going to go over some of the actual devices, some of the technical stuff. So Bruce DePalma, basically the truths of this is gravitation and inertia are not equivalent. Contrary to Einstein's assumptions, rotation alters both gravitation and inertia, making them both variable under its influence. So the idea is that if you're spinning something with a magnetic field, it can overcome. It's anti-gravity stuff, basically. There exists a generally unrecognized mass field of polarized inertia around a real rotating object. This field affects the properties of matter, energy, and living systems exposed to it. So it could be looked at this as like a vibrational field too, which is, there's some deeper science now that's coming to light a lot more about this multi energetic fields that are basically interacting with each other to create standing waves and create some odd, strange things. We'll get into John Hutchinson and that craziness in a second too. That goes deeply into this, and also some Tesla. We got to talk about some Tesla tech, right? Because that's just goes without saying. You talk about free energy and you think of Tesla. So I probably should have mentioned him earlier, but I will get into a lot of research I've done about that gentleman. So The field affects the properties of matter, energy, and living systems exposed to it. A rotating magnetized gyroscope, or homopolar generator, does not conform to the law of conservation of energy. So the law of conservation of energy is the second law of thermodynamics, like I said, which means that when a system is exchanging via entropy or entropy, there's a loss from one system to the other. Although the first law states there's no energy can neither be created nor destroyed. The second law states that things are getting more complex, or some people look at it as like the universe is cooling down. It's kind of a pretty drab way to look at it. It's kind of sad when you look at it that way. Very pessimistic approach. I don't necessarily agree with, but that's how some people look at it. The truth is there is hot spots and cold spots all over the universe being created by different energetic happenings, and I honestly like to keep my mind very open about those things and not say things as a matter of fact. The only thing we can say for a matter of fact is energy exists, and from all perspective that we've seen, systems do get more complex and when they interact with each other, and that energy can neither be created nor destroyed, because in order to create energy, you usually have to destroy something or disrupt something to make an energy of a certain set. It changes. I guess a better statement would be, energy is always changing, and that's truly the universal constant in all things. In entrepreneurship, in creating, in engineering, in life itself. Like, things are always changing. So that's the one universal constant for sure. So, but back to this DePalma stuff, after a lifetime of resistance to these emerging new energy concepts in the United States, DePalma finally sought a more favorable climate for his experimental and theoretical pursuits. He found support and acceptance in New Zealand, ultimately becoming permanent resident. During the last 5 years of his life, DePalma would build 3 separate prototypes with the assistance of the New Zealand and Australian investors. The second unit was calorimetrically tested by University of Auckland faculty and shown to produce a 1.25 watts for every 1 watt of input power. So that is a COP of 1.25. So that's right. Yes, that would be a COP. So if you put in 1 watt and it put out 1 watt, that would be a COP of 1. This is a COP of 1.25. So, question, and this is probably they said calorimetry, so they obviously measured heat, and not obviously, but hopefully they measured the heat and all different energetic aspects of it. So heat, torque, rotational speed, energy, electrical energy, all of those aspects hopefully were measured in that experiment, because it's extremely important. So the question of where the one-piece Faraday disk end machine space power generator derives its energy remains unanswered by mainstream science. Since there is no relative motion between magnet or conductor, it is believed that only space itself can be the medium from which the power is precipitated. Indeed, the free energy paradigm rests on the reality that space as a dynamic medium wherein all potentials are isotropically uniformly distributed. When rotation is coupled, superposed, with magnetic field, the combined effect is a potent distortion of space sufficient to cause electrons to pop into existence, something that's called virtual photons, virtual electrons. It's something in quantum theory. They go over to here. So it's sufficient to cause electrons to pop into existence with the end machine's conductors. Quantum theory now admits that particles are being created and destroyed all the time. Even though energy can neither be created nor destroyed, a particle is matter. So it's a little bit different. It's components of energy that pop into existence and disappear, probably from interacting fields. Oh, who would have thought? So this is referred to as a zero-point energy fluctuations, and is now accepted to be a viable explanation for what we observe in several free energy technologies. So they put it very well there. And the concept of zero-point energy is something that's been around for a long time. It used to be called, like, before it was like the Higgs boson and stuff like that, or not the Higgs boson, but the Einstein condensate. It was called the ether, or the luminous ether. And back in traditional time, I would say really the turn of the industrial revolution, and when physics, and even before then actually, actually probably, to be completely honest, it probably dates all the way back to very ancient times of like in Indian cultures, and I mean it's probably too many to even take a guess at, but the idea is that there's a prana, I think it would be considered prana in India, but a all-encompassing energy, like a incompressible fluid or a medium in which all things pervade through and move through, and it gives rise to all life is the idea behind it. So this ether kind of got dismissed later on as Einstein started to do his equations. However, before he passed away, and on many of his unfinished theoretical equations, he did hint at there being some type of medium there, and that there has to be, and that's kind of how the Bose-Einstein condensate came about, and the 0-point energy, and when things go to zero, how things can never go to absolute zero. Even in temperature-wise, we call something absolute zero when it gets into the zero range, but it still has energetic happenings. There's still vibrations in that medium, and so there is never an absolute zero. We're always just chasing the absolute zero. Once again, like change is a universal constant, so everything's always changing. There's always and particles popping in and out of existence, as they say in this. So another interesting thing to look into, and now I'll get into Tesla, even though this is backtracking as far as the time period. But Tesla, his hopes were to create abundant energy for the entire planet. Now, I think that a lot of people misconstrue this as free energy. This is where it really gets deep into the dynamics of like the philosophy of free energy and the mental constructs that we've created around this kind of that really goes all the way into thermodynamics, to be honest. Like the very concept that energy can neither be created nor destroyed, brings us up into principles of God and the Big Bang, which is deep shit, like it's super deep. And stuff that cannot be something that we've always tested. We can test via experimentally, but how we interpret it can always have different variances. But for the most part, these are universal or natural laws that exist, because every time that we do a test experimentally, the result always goes the same way. So especially for the first law of thermodynamics. Now, for the second law of thermodynamics, things get a little muddled. Like I was saying earlier, there's a concept that the universe is getting colder and getting more chaotic. And like I said, that's a very pessimistic way to look at it, and it's kind of a narrow mindset to look at it, considering that we don't even know the edges of the universe or what's beyond the background microwave radiation that we can see. That's from remnants of what's supposedly the Big Bang. Which could very well just be like a universal cell wall. There could be a whole other universe on the other side. We don't know these things, and to say that we do is very short-sighted, and why it may be comfortable, that's not what science is about. Science is always about testing the limits, asking nature, what's there and how far can we go. So that being said, the second law of thermodynamics, there's something called Gibbs free energy, and what Gibbs free energy states is, and it's funny it has free energy in it, right, is this is a chemical model, but for the most part, if you have a system, right, that you consider to be closed, okay, which is the first fallacy, because you can never have a completely closed system. Like, let's say you have a coffee cup, okay? This is a classic coffee cup example of the second law of thermodynamics. And you pour your coffee in there. Now, over time, the coffee and the water will separate, all right? And the only way to get them to combine, right, is to stir it, right? So it separates, or stir it or heat it. Both pretty much are they kind of the same thing. One is on the atomic scale, you're stirring it, you're vibrating all the atoms, and on a larger scale, you're using kinetic energy by stirring it with a spoon or whatever. Nonetheless, you have to put energy back into it for its components to be connected. Now, the systems involved in that are the coffee itself and the coffee cup medium, right, for which the heat is going to the colder areas. The energy always wants to balance, right? Nature's all about balance. So the coffee and the room itself is kind of the large scale system, and energy is always going to balance itself out and go to the larger amount of capacity to do so. So that's why you have, like, you know, the universe has like cold vacuum of space. Like, that space in between everything is the balance. That's really the universe trying to balance things out. If that did not exist, you would have things like coffee never getting cold, or perhaps even worse, it keeps getting hotter and hotter, which would be detrimental to, like, the universe itself. Like, it would get so hot eventually, you know, that there would be nothing but heat, if that makes sense. So there has to be some type of universal balance. It's a beautiful phenomenon of nature that I'm so grateful for, because we wouldn't exist otherwise. And instead of trying to impose our will, you know, science is supposed to understand these principles. And so to just simply dismiss things that are getting more chaotic is, like I said, very short-sighted. It's basically just saying everything is going to get completely cold, and one day everything will be completely cold. Well, maybe to our perception, but in general, that's not necessarily the case, because there's constantly energetic fields interacting that are part of Gibbs free energy, which is that one system is contributing energy to another system, and in some cases they're bringing the energy level up to a higher state of existence, right? And we don't even know what the bottom of the energy level is, like the absolute zero, the standing wave nodes in a sound wave, which seems to make stuff levitate, which is really interesting, and just being zero, you know. And but that's the levitation example. My voice cracked like a high school teenager. The levitation example is, you know, you're putting energy into something, but it's two interacting fields. You know, you either have a reflective field from the original radiating source, or you have two radiating sources that are pointed at each other, or more. You know, it can be more than two, obviously, but it at least takes two to tango. So considering those things is really important. And so now with that greater grasp of the technical shit, hopefully I didn't make too much craziness as far as the technical, from what I understand it, which, you know, could be completely wrong. I could be completely wrong about this stuff, and if I am, I encourage you to drop me a line, say something, and, you know, have some counterpoints. This is supposed to be a conversation. So now we're going to go full circle back into this mythical man back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, named Nikola Tesla. So Nikola Tesla, if you don't know, was born in Serbia, Croatia. You know, they're battling it out who gets to claim rights to his name. But he was an ingenious man who came up with basically the modern day electrical system, battled Edison. I mean, there's tons of stories. It's really easy to look up and know his story, but then there's a lot of different perceptions of it. And I like to keep things very open. The things we do know about him is that he really did not give a fuck about money, and really cared about making life easier for people and taking nature's cues and creating things. He was like one of the most amazing engineers, and he pretty much was the beginning of electrical engineering. I mean, he helped pioneer what is now an electrical engineer. And he had some incredibly futuristic concepts, or incredibly far-seeing concepts. And he didn't look at things in terms of a year or 2 years and things of that nature. He really looked big picture stuff, which I appreciate. And it's evident that he did, because he has lots of writings about it. But the more important writings he has is all of his experiments. He actually has quite a bit. If you just do your research, like Colorado Springs, for example, and you go and you look at some of those experiments, some of the equations are pretty gnarly calculus equations, and they can be very challenging. Differential calculus, wave dynamics, all kinds of really crazy calculations. But the experiments themselves are something to at least take note of and look at. And one of the most amazing experiments, there's a couple of really amazing experiments he did, but one of the most amazing experiments was something he started in New York, but then he realized he had to go to a much more rural area to not affect people around, energy, or, fields of energy around him. He really had this concept of energy down pretty packed, to be honest. And he always, one of the things that he wrote about was if you want to understand the secrets of the universe, you look at, people say it's the 3, 6, and 9. I don't know if he ever said anything like that. I don't know. I haven't seen that, like the fact checking of that, but I do know that he said, look, see in terms of vibration, frequency, and energy. And basically the vibration is, what frequency something's at, right? What particular field of a body is vibrating. Like all of our atoms are vibrating at a certain fundamental frequency. And like elements themselves, hydrogen, helium, all that stuff, they all vibrate at a fundamental frequency. And it's like music. If you look at it in terms of music, every instrument has a fundamental frequency that it's played at, right? You play it and it has just a fundamental frequency and a range that it stays within. It can't really go out of that range, otherwise you'll break the instrument. So the same principles apply to all energy around, and what really differentiates between low vibrational energy, high vibrational energy, and frequency, and matter, I should say, matter itself. The concept of E equals mc squared. The approach towards energy is matter squared. Matter and universal constant squared, and the universal constant of light is what and the C stands for in E equals mc squared. And that's a very short and simplified version of that. I won't get too much into Einstein's equations. That's for a whole nother podcast. But Tesla essentially wanted to connect to the Earth's capacitance after he started experimenting a lot more and realizing that, hey, the Earth has a resonant frequency itself and a capacitance. And a lot of people will say that this is crazy talk or whatever, but it's actually not. It's all documented, and he talks about it quite a bit. One of the things that he goes over a lot is lightning. In Colorado Springs especially, there is something called it's a hermetically sealed nickel chip device, and it's called, cat whisker device. I can't remember its actual name. Essentially, it picks up large electromagnetic fields and dielectric fields, just electricity. It picks up large electrical radiation, right, pulses. So he used that to find out, to see lightning, essentially from hundreds of miles away. He made a very sensitive one, used that to find lightning. That's in the Colorado Springs. But more importantly, this is a man who sat for months on end and would design an experiment according to some of the things that he learned from his predecessors, carry out experiments and just test things out and ask nature really the questions. And then he would use mathematics to write it down, to express it to other people, because that's really what math is for, right? It's a language to express, to convey to other people. It's a universal language, so there's no language barrier. You can actually see this mathematic work and be like, okay, well this is exactly how many turns something needs to be on a coil. This is how much energy you put into it. All the labels and measurements we've made from people of the past. So in doing this, he created. He came up with an idea to make, or he was experimenting with frequencies or high frequencies and high voltages, high pressure electricity. And if you look at electricity in terms of water, right, you have a pool of water. In order to move the water, you have to disturb it, right? And he was looking at ways to disturb it very quickly with high velocity. So basically, like taking a rock and throwing it at the speed, or shooting a bullet into this pool, and it's disturbing the water, and seeing what it does when you disturb the water in such a manner. So when doing this, he discovered a lot of interesting effects. One being what's called the skin effect, where electricity of high voltages could pass right over your skin, and this is what is modern day radiography and radio communications came from this very same principle. It's the reason why they can put gigawatts of power out at a 2 gigahertz frequency, or even in the megahertz frequency. And so long as you have tuning in place for a receiver to tune into the actual transmitter, you can tune into the radio signal without getting electrocuted, without getting burned. And this very much follows that particular style that he had, very much, or that particular style that was discovered and is now in practice, focuses on the inverse square law. and goes off that model. And that also depending on the waveguide, which is basically your megaphone for how you're transmitting the power. It's it's how we do standard day radio communications. However, Tesla had a different vision. He envisioned, and he stated this very openly, he envisioned a universal, like a global power grid. And people thought he was nuts. Of course he was nuts. He's a little crazy. All the fun people are crazy. But his idea behind it was actually to take the resonant frequency and the capacitance of the Earth itself, and to take that and be able to transmit power anywhere on the world, and then the communications would come after, and they would ride on the power wave, right? So you could have smaller subwaves that you can tune into, but first and foremost, it would be this large power wave that you'd be able to basically put a receiver into a ground, because the ground is part of the conductor, and then something that will reach up high enough to accept energy from the ionosphere. And so it's essentially using the ionosphere and the ground as conductive medium. So like two wires, just like we have now. And actually, there's even a one wire systems that he demonstrated. So it could be potentially possible to use just one singular wire and be able to produce energy that way. But the one wire did rely on essentially near field effects and really harmonic frequencies. And there's lots of demonstrations of that. I won't go too deep into that, but just to let you know for sure, this technology was viable. It would take a lot of development, and probably more than just Tesla was able to handle. It would have been a lifelong project for him for the rest of his life. Unfortunately, it got nixed, and the common thought process behind why it got destroyed, his whole Wardenclyffe Tower, which is what he developed these theories and hypotheses and then experiments at Colorado Springs, but then took them to New York and made Wardenclyffe Tower and proposed it to his investors. And the reason why the investors pulled out is it was going over budget and it was going over cost, but that's really not what most people think. The reason why it was cut is simply because J.P. Morgan was highly involved, and he was one of the founding investors of General Electric, and he was standing to make a lot of money off of establishing cable systems, which is what they were already working on, is cable systems throughout the U.S. of copper lines and aluminum lines and whatever lines, conductive lines to carry electricity across the U.S. And they were already worked out the problems and Tesla actually helped in this as well, but they worked out the problems of the frequency of a cable line, and Tesla basically, we say he invented AC, but he discovered alternating currents, and actually a person before him discovered it, but he perfected alternating currents and how they should be used instead of direct currents. That was the battle he had with Edison. But in doing so, there were some problems of loss through a line over distance, and a man named off of both the work of Michael Faraday and of Maxwell's equations and stuff. There's a man named Heaviside and Steinmetz and a couple other gentlemen who helped pave the way in finding resonant frequencies of actual material, and that's why we have a 50 and 60 hertz, is because it aligns with the resonant frequency of closer to matter, and in particular copper lines and the Earth's resonance and all that kind of stuff is basic understanding. It's closer to a resonant frequency, and using those lines you can transmit power for a lot further distance because there's no impedance. There's not as much impedance in the line as it goes down the line, and impedance is basically a form of resistance in AC current. So in DC, it's called resistance. In AC lines, it's called impedance. And the reason why it's called impedance is because there can be like sloshing, if you think of it this way. If you're sloshing a water, or a tube of water back and forth, right? That's AC. You're sloshing that water back and forth. Now, if you slosh it in weird intervals that don't sync up, what ends up happening is you have these disruptive waves that smash into each other and kind of nullify, and you create standing waves depending on standing waves are like, just low spots and high spots. These low and high troughs, you actually, if those don't line up, if they don't become uniform, you have just a flat line, and you're not transmitting any power whatsoever. That's a simple way to put it, right? So you actually need those peaks and valleys, the high and low spots to transmit power. So Tesla helped come up with a lot of those concepts, and JP Morgan, as well as some other investors, I'm sure, didn't like the idea that Tesla was starting to become very vocal about, which is creating power across the U.S. Across the world that's wireless, that anybody can tap into for free. Okay, so this really goes into the heart and the philosophy of free energy itself right here. This is kind of, goes beyond the perpetual motion, because Tesla didn't look at it like perpetual motion. He looked at it like there is a ton of energy out there. There's an abundance of energy. I mean, the fucking sun is dumping a shit ton of energy on us, and we can tap into this energy using the earth as the earth's natural capacitance and resonate with the earth, helping more people out, bringing power to people who don't have it. Bringing lighting was really his biggest thing. He wanted to bring more light to people's homes. And so those concepts are really what he stood by and really were powerful to him, and what was his whole life mission. Well, people who are deeply invested for self-interest in the money game, right, are obviously not going to want to let go of their business, right? People are going to, when the problem arises, they want to find any solution to counter that problem. Their problem would be, okay, this is going to be completely disruptive to my market. We don't want this. So JP Morgan pulled the plug. That's the supposed story. Whether that's true or not is still, there's some speculation on it. However, from a lot of the research that I've done, I truly believe that a world power grid system like Tesla talked about is possible. Now here's where the interesting parts come in, is we don't know like the dangers in it, because if you're messing with a capacitor with an extremely high amount of power like the earth, if you do something wrong with it, you're going to do something really wrong with it, and there's going to be some serious problems. So I think that's probably why he was over budget, because he was being very safe. And there's some crazy stories of him using plasma technology to blow stuff up, and it's destructive purposes that could be held there. And I think that those also are very valid and do in fact exist to this day. Things that we don't know enough about. Now, it's still very speculative. I'm not saying that this is a matter of fact. I'm saying the probability of it is at least 50-50. So it's certainly, if it's 50-50, there's certainly some credence to it. There's certainly some support, some evidence to show. But moving on to the deeper side, the philosophical side, right? Going into, and I'll go into some more free energy stuff, because it's one of my favorite topics to talk about, because it really goes into technical things. It goes into the human psyche. It's like an incredible thing to talk about, the very concept of things being free and freedom, right? And you hear it so much, and so the monetary system in general is something that counters free energy, and this is where it really gets heated. And some people have a hard time kind of accepting it, and I have a hard time conveying it, to be honest. But we have a system right now, and we've had it for quite a long time, of scarcity is a commodity. Like, it can be a commodity. Scarcity is something that we use in order to make a profit off of, right? We control supply and demand, or we understand supply and demand. We bring a product to the market if there's a huge demand for it in the market, it's been tested and the market says, yes, there's a huge demand for it, people want it, we bring the supply and we make a lot of money off of it. If you can control the supply and demand, as OPEC has shown, and many, there's a huge list of controlling supply and demand and how profitable that is. But if you control the supply and demand, you become very wealthy as well. If you create a demand, right, that's one way to do it, like with marketing, or if you throttle the supply and make sure that there's not too much supply out there through patents, this is a problem. So this is, in my opinion, Tesla's biggest folly, is that he patented all of his work. And in doing so, and this is a folly of many free energy people, in doing so, you're going against the very paradigm that's put in place, a status quo of of free enterprise. It's not even free enterprise, it's capitalism, and being able to bring a product to the market that will give any investor a return. Now, if it's a philanthropic approach you have, that would be different. And if Tesla went that route and kept things in the Creative Common, and perhaps he realized this mistake later on in his life, or perhaps I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about. That's also very could very well be. But if he took that approach instead and made his mission more philanthropic to be able to give power to the world, that could have been a better avenue, and we might have actually seen that technology. However, he was not into money. Money was not his game. He wasn't engineering enterprises. He wasn't engineering. He wasn't an entrepreneur type of mindset. He had a specialist type of mindset. He was very specialized at science, and he didn't in particular physics and applied science and electrical engineering. He didn't go into the science of business. So with that, I ask you guys, what do you think? Do you think that if Tesla took the approach of business science and understood business science a little better, or there's one case where the person who helped him make the AC motor and also helped him with the alternating current system was Westinghouse, right? If he would have claimed good on Westinghouse, promised that for every motor sold he would get a royalty. Westinghouse ended up selling a shit ton of these motors, way more than he expected, and Tesla was entitled to a multi-million-dollar royalty. If he would have taken that multi-million-dollars and used it towards what he wanted to build, maybe the outcome would have been different. So what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. Hit me up, direct message me, whatever you want to do. Also, I have a Discord channel. You guys can join a Facebook channel, all that kind of stuff to really strike up a conversation, to really, talk about some more stuff. And if you want to join this podcast, if you want to be part of this podcast, I encourage you, reach out to me and, let's make some dialogue and really discuss some not only kick-ass stories, but let's discuss some things that we can do to engineer a better future and to open up conversations that actually mean something, that hopefully will inspire people and educate people through some form of entertainment. So much love to you all. I appreciate you watching this. I have to go pick up my son from the bus stop. I'm kind of pushing this a little late because I was late getting on. But that's the third episode of the Free Energy. This is I'll probably go into this topic many, many more times. But please leave your comments and let me know what you think. Much love to you all. Peace.